The year of our Lord 1882 bled across the plains of the Wyoming Territory in hues of ochre and rust. It was a land of brutal honesty, a place that stripped a man of his pretenses and left only the gristle and bone of his character. The wind was a constant preacher, its sermon a scouring whisper that carried dust from the ground and peeled the paint from the solitary church steeple in the nearest town. Redemption. Here, the sky was not a gentle blanket but an immense, watchful eye, its blue gaze so vast and unrelenting it could make a man feel like an insect crawling on a dinner plate. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth until the very air shimmered with heat. In summer, it baked the soil into a mosaic of fissures. In winter, the wind carried a blade of ice sharp enough to cut a man to the soul. Survival was not an achievement but a daily, grinding negotiation with God and dirt. This was the world of Silas Evans. His domain was 160 acres of this unforgiving land. A homestead marked by a simple log cabin he had built with his own 2 hands, a sturdy barn, and fences that sagged like tired shoulders against the endless expanse. Silas himself seemed carved from the same material as his surroundings. At 40, his face was a roadmap of his life's hardships, etched with lines the sun and sorrow had drawn. His hands were thick with calluses, the knuckles swollen, tools shaped for work and nothing more. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who conserves his energy because he knows the day is long and tomorrow will be longer. For 7 years, Silas had been a man alone, a widower walking through the ghost of a life. His wife, Eleanor, had been the light and breath of this place. Her laughter, he remembered, was like the sound of the creek in spring, a melody that promised life, but the land that gives can also take with a cruel, indifferent hand. She had died in the bed that still stood in the corner of the cabin, her life given in a desperate, failed bid to bring their first child into the world. The baby, a boy, had followed her into the silence before he could even draw his first breath. Silas had buried them both on the small rise behind the cabin, beneath the lone cottonwood tree, and in that raw, gaping earth, he had buried his heart as well. The man who rose from his knees was a different creature, hollowed out, silent, and walled off from the treacherous landscape of emotion. He spoke to his cattle in low murmurs, to his horse with a gruff affection, but to men, his words were few and clipped, like currency he was loath to spend. He saw feeling as a fool's game, a vulnerability that had cost him everything. Work was his only penance, his only prayer. The cycle of the seasons, the turning of the soil, the mending of fences, this was his liturgy. He toiled from sunup to sundown, seeking an exhaustion so profound it would grant him the mercy of a dreamless sleep. But time, like the steady drip of water on stone, was wearing him down. The harvests grew thinner, the weeds more defiant. His body, once a bastion of strength, now ached with a persistent, dull fire. One evening, sitting at his small wooden table, staring at the empty chair where Eleanor used to sit, a terrifying thought took root in his mind. He was failing. The farm, the legacy he had built on sweat and sorrow, was slipping through his fingers. The silence of the cabin pressed in on him, no longer a comfort but a crushing weight. Loneliness, he realized, was not just an ache in the heart. It was a practical impediment. He needed help. The idea came to him not in a flash of inspiration, but as a reluctant, final concession to his own limitations. A mail-order bride. He'd seen the advertisements in the back of the Farmer's Almanac asterisk. Thin columns of text filled with hopeful, desperate words. He'd always scoffed at them, at the notion of buying a wife like a new plow or a sack of seed. But now, the pragmatism of it appealed to the cold, hard man he had become. He wasn't seeking love. Love was a ghost he had no desire to confront. He needed a pair of hands, a partner in labor, not in life, a woman to cook, to clean, to mend, to help run the brutal machinery of survival. He wrote the letter that night by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. His script was blocky, unpracticed. There were no flourishes, no gentle words of courtship. It was a contract. Asterisk, to whom it may concern. Asterisk, I am a landowner. Name of Silas Evans, age 40, widower. Own 160 acres, a cabin, a barn, and livestock in the Wyoming Territory. I am in good health and a hard worker. Asterisk, I seek a wife. Must be of strong constitution and not afraid of work. Must be willing to share the burdens of a farm life. Honesty and a plain character are valued. I can offer a home, provision, and my name. No idlers need apply. Asterisk, send response to the post office in redemption. Asterisk, sincerely. Asterisk, asterisk, Silas Evans. He read it over. The stark words a perfect reflection of the man he was. It was a bleak proposal, but it was an honest one. He sealed the envelope and, the next day, rode the 10 miles into town to post it, feeling not a flicker of hope or anticipation, only the grim satisfaction of a problem addressed. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Hundreds of miles to the east, in a prim, suffocating town in Pennsylvania. Clara Thompson read his words. For her, they were not bleak. They were a lifeline. Clara's world was not one of open spaces and physical hardship, but of small rooms and whispered cruelties. She was 28, a woman branded and cast out, her life a ruin built on a foundation of lies. She had once been betrothed to the town banker's son, a man whose promises had seemed as solid as the stone of the church they attended every Sunday. But a shadow had been cast upon her virtue, a vicious rumor started by a spurned suitor. It was a lie, a piece of malicious fiction, but in a town where a woman's reputation was her only currency, the accusation was as good as a conviction. Her fiancé, a man of weak character dressed in a strong suit, had abandoned her at the first whiff of scandal. Her family, mortified and shamed, had turned their backs. The final blow came when the Reverend, from his pulpit, delivered a sermon on the sins of the flesh, his eyes fixed upon her, making her a living example of a fallen woman. She was an outcast. The polite smiles of her neighbors had turned to thin, cruel lines. The women clutched their children closer when she passed. She was utterly alone, adrift in a sea of pious condemnation. Silas Evans's advertisement, which she found in a discarded newspaper, was not a proposal of marriage. It was an escape hatch. The West. The name itself sounded like freedom. It was a place, she imagined, that was too big for whispers to travel. A land where a person was judged not by their past, but by the strength of their hands and the resilience of their spirit. She wrote her reply with a trembling hand, her words as honest as his. Asterisk, Mr. Evans. Asterisk, my name is Clara Thompson. I am 28 years of age. I have seen your advertisement and wish to respond. Asterisk, I am in good health and I am not afraid of work. I can cook, sew, and tend a garden. My character is plain, and my past is my own. I seek only an honest life and a new beginning. If you will have me, I will be a diligent and loyal wife. Asterisk, I can be ready to travel as soon as I receive your reply and fare for the train. Asterisk, yours, respectfully. Asterisk, Clara Thompson. The exchange was swift. A letter arrived with a train ticket and a single, stark sentence. Asterisk, be on the train that arrives in Redemption on the 5th of September. Clara packed her life into a single, worn leather suitcase. She took no mementos, no photographs, nothing that tied her to the life that had rejected her. As she boarded the train, she did not look back. The journey west was a rattling, jarring pilgrimage into the unknown. The neat green hills of Pennsylvania flattened into the wide, monotonous plains of the heartland, and then gave way to the stark, raw beauty of the high desert. With every mile that passed, she felt the suffocating weight of her old life lifting, replaced by the nervous, thrilling terror of a future she could not predict. The train finally wheezed to a halt at a small, sun-bleached platform that bore a simple sign, Redemption. The name felt like a cosmic joke. Clara stepped down onto the splintered wood, clutching her suitcase, the dust of the platform instantly coating the hem of her simple, gray traveling dress. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with a handful of wooden buildings. The air was thin and dry. And there he was. He stood apart from the small clutch of people waiting, a tall, solitary figure who seemed more a part of the landscape than the town. Silas Evans was exactly as his letter had sounded, stark, weathered, and unadorned. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that was all sharp angles and sun-cured leather. He wore work clothes, clean but faded, and his posture was rigid, uncomfortable. He was watching the passengers descend, his eyes scanning them with an unnerving intensity. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the man who held her future in his calloused hands. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and began to walk toward him. As she approached, his gaze finally settled on her, and for a moment, it held. She saw his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, like the winter sky. They were filled with a weariness that seemed ancient. There was no welcome in them, no kindness, only a quiet, thorough assessment. Silas watched her come. This was the woman. She was not what he had pictured. He had expected someone either beaten down by life, with desperation in her eyes, or perhaps someone hard and calculating. This woman was neither. There was a resilience in the way she held herself, a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her circumstance. She was not beautiful in the way Eleanor had been, not soft or delicate. There was a strength in the line of her jaw, a startling clarity in her direct gaze, even though she looked tired from her journey. She didn't look broken. She looked guarded. She stopped a few feet from him, the space between them charged with a thick, awkward silence. "Mr. Evans?" Her voice was lower than he expected, and steady, despite the tremor she was trying so hard to conceal. He gave a curt, single nod. "Ma'am, you'd be Miss Thompson." It wasn't a question. "I am," she said. The silence stretched again, pulled taut between them. He made no move to smile, no gesture of welcome. He simply stood there, a formidable, unreadable presence. He had not expected her to be so composed. He found himself avoiding her eyes. "Finally." He gestured with his head toward the dusty street. "The wagon's this way." He turned without another word and started walking, expecting her to follow. He did not offer to take her bag. It was not a deliberate slight, but an oversight born of years of self-reliance. He was not accustomed to gestures of courtesy. Clara stood frozen for a second, a cold knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. This was it. This was her new life. A silent, stone-faced man, and a land that seemed determined to swallow her whole. Then, she tightened her grip on the handle of her suitcase, the worn leather a familiar comfort in her hand. She had not come this far to falter now. She followed him, her footsteps making small puffs in the thick dust. They walked toward a simple buckboard wagon hitched to a sturdy-looking horse. Between them was a silence as vast and profound as the territory that stretched out before them. A silence filled with the unspoken weight of two pasts, two solitudes, now bound together under the immense, indifferent Wyoming sky. Clara stepped onto the dusty soil of Promise Creek with a lie lodged in her throat like a stone. She carried the weight of a solemn vow, a promise made in a room that smelled of sickness and farewell. To her sister, Elizabeth, whose bright spirit had been extinguished by fever just 2 months prior. It was Elizabeth who had spun dreams from the letters of a man named Elias Thorne, a man she had never met but whose words, filled with a quiet yearning for companionship, had painted a picture of a life of substance and sincerity under the wide western sky. Now, Elizabeth was gone, and Clara was here, a ghost assuming her sister's name and her sister's future. The promise had been a fevered, desperate command. "Go for me, Clara! Don't let him be alone! His letters! He's so alone!" And so Clara had come, propelled by grief and duty, to marry a stranger in her dead sister's stead. She kept the truth locked behind a carefully constructed wall of silence, observing the man who met her at the stagecoach depot. The Elias from the letters had been a steady, pragmatic voice, a man who wrote of cattle prices and the challenges of a dry season with a simple, unadorned prose. Clara had pictured someone older, perhaps, his face weathered into a mask of gentle resignation. The man before her was a shock. He couldn't have been more than 25, younger than herself by 3 years. There was a raw, untamed energy about him, a tension in his shoulders and a guardedness in his eyes that the letters had completely concealed. His face was lean and shadowed, not by age, but by a profound, restless solitude. His hands, gripping the reins of his horse, were not the gentle hands of a letter writer. They were scarred and calloused, instruments of hard labor. He was a man locked within himself, and Clara felt the first sharp pang of a complication she had not foreseen. As Elias loaded her single trunk onto the back of his wagon, 2 figures emerged from the shade of the livery stable. They were women, their dark hair braided, their deerskin dresses a stark contrast to the faded calico of the town's other inhabitants. Apache. They moved with a fluid silence that was both graceful and unsettling, their dark eyes fixing on Clara with an unnerving intensity. It was not a hostile gaze, but it was deeply, unnervingly perceptive, as if they could see the fragile scaffolding of her deceit. They said nothing, simply watched as Elias finished his work, their stillness a silent testament to a story Clara did not yet understand. Elias, for his part, seemed oblivious to their scrutiny, or perhaps so accustomed to it that he no longer paid it any mind. He helped Clara onto the wagon seat with a rough, impersonal touch, his fingers barely brushing her arm before retreating as if from a flame. The ride out of Promise Creek was a journey through a gauntlet of whispers. The town, it seemed, had been waiting for her arrival with a cruel, hungry anticipation. "That's the third one," a man cackled from the porch of the saloon. "Thorne's collecting 'em like stray cattle." 2 women, their faces pinched with pious disapproval, stopped outside the general store, their voices a low, venomous buzz. "First the savages, now a mail order. The man has no shame. What kind of woman would go to him?" The words were like small, sharp stones pelting her. Clara kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on the endless, dusty road ahead, but she could feel the heat of a blush creep up her neck. This was not the simple, quiet life Elizabeth had imagined. This was a spectacle. She glanced at Elias. His jaw was set like granite, a muscle twitching near his temple, the only outward sign that he heard the jeers. He stared straight ahead, his silence a shield, but a brittle one. It was the silence of a man who had been weathering this kind of storm his entire life. A few bold young men, loafers propped against a hitching post, tipped their hats with exaggerated gallantry. "Evening, ma'am," one called out, his grin predatory. "No need to settle for Thorne's leavings. A pretty thing like you could do a whole lot better." Elias's hands tightened on the reins, the leather creaking in protest, but he did not rise to the bait. He just clicked his tongue, urging the horse into a faster trot, leaving the town and its casual cruelty behind in a cloud of dust. The ranch was miles from anywhere, a solitary outpost in a sea of rolling, sun-scorched hills. A small, sturdy-looking cabin and a larger barn stood as defiant figures against the overwhelming emptiness of the land. It was stark and beautiful, but its isolation was absolute. This was the source of the loneliness in his letters, a palpable presence that seemed to emanate from the very soil. As they arrived, the 2 Apache women were already there, having taken a different path. They moved about the property with a quiet familiarity, one tending a small, hardy-looking garden near the cabin, the other carrying water from a well. They acknowledged their arrival with another of those long, unreadable looks before returning to their tasks. Elias pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down. He said nothing as he untied her trunk and carried it to the cabin porch with an easy strength that belied his lean frame. He kept his distance, a deliberate space of several feet between them at all times. He was a fortress, and his walls were high. "I'll show you your room," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. The cabin was larger inside than it appeared, but just as sparse. It consisted of one main room that served as a kitchen and living area, with a large stone hearth at one end. A door led to a second, smaller room. This was where he led her. It was barely big enough for the narrow bed, a small wooden crate for a nightstand, and a single window that looked out onto the endless plains. But it was clean. A simple handmade quilt was folded neatly on the mattress. "This is yours," he stated, setting her trunk down. "The kitchen is there. Outhouse is out back. The women are Atsa and Nali. They won't bother you." He paused, as if struggling with what to say next. "I'll be in the barn for a bit." And then he was gone, leaving Clara alone in the suffocating silence of her new life. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the straw-filled mattress rustling beneath her. The lie she carried felt heavier than ever. She had come to comfort a lonely man, but the man she had met was a stranger, wrapped in a coat of armor made of pride and pain, and surrounded by a mystery she couldn't begin to fathom. Sleep refused to come that night. The world outside her window was alive with alien sounds, the mournful cry of a distant coyote, the lowing of cattle, and the relentless, whispering voice of the wind as it scoured the corners of the cabin. It was a symphony of desolation, and it echoed the emptiness in her own heart. Through the thin wooden wall that separated her room from the main living area, she could hear the sounds of Elias, the scrape of a chair, the soft clink of a glass, the almost inaudible sigh of a man carrying a weight too heavy for one soul. For hours, she listened, imagining him sitting in the darkness. She knew he was not asleep. There was a restlessness in his movements, a profound and sorrowful energy that bled through the walls. Curiosity, mingled with a strange and unwelcome sense of compassion, finally compelled her to move. Silently, she slipped out of bed, her bare feet cold on the rough-hewn floorboards. She crept to the door and eased it open a crack, peering into the main room. The hearth was cold, the only light a pale, silver beam of moonlight slanting through the front window. It fell upon Elias, who sat at the small wooden table, just as she had imagined. He was a silhouette of despair. A half-empty bottle of whiskey stood before him, the amber liquid glowing faintly in the moonlight. He held a glass in one hand, staring down into it as if searching for an answer in its depths. His shoulders were slumped, not with fatigue, but with the crushing burden of his thoughts. He looked impossibly young and utterly lost. This was the man the town mocked, the man her sister had dreamed of, the man who was now, by a cruel twist of fate, her intended husband. He seemed 1,000 miles away from the stoic, impenetrable figure who had met her at the stagecoach. This was the truth of him, raw and unguarded. He raised the glass to his lips, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he lowered it, his gaze drifting to the window, to the vast, dark emptiness outside that was a mirror to the emptiness within. He wasn't just drinking. He was holding a vigil. He was mourning something. Watching him, hidden in the shadows of her doorway, Clara felt the carefully constructed walls around her own heart begin to crumble. The promise to her sister, which had been a clear and simple duty, now felt tangled and complex. This was not a straightforward transaction of companionship. This was something deeper, something far more wounded. A profound and aching empathy stirred within her, a feeling she had not allowed herself to experience for anyone in years. It was a painful, terrifying sensation, like the thawing of a limb long frozen, in the shared silence of that lonely cabin, under the indifferent watch of the moon. Clara felt the first, dangerous flicker of a fire she thought had long gone out, a warmth that was part compassion, part sorrow, and part a terrifying, nascent desire to understand the soul of the broken man on the other side of the wall. The morning broke, sharp and clear, the sun a pale lemon rind on the eastern horizon. The air was cold, carrying the clean, lonely scent of sagebrush and dust. Clara was already awake, having spent another night listening to the profound silence of the man in the next room. She found him by the corral, his back to her, mending a split rail with methodical, angry-looking motions. He didn't turn when she approached, but she knew he was aware of her every footstep. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat. The words aimed at the fence post he was wrapping with rawhide. He didn't stop his work. Clara waited, her hands clasped in front of her to still their trembling. He finally finished, pulling the knot tight with a vicious tug. He turned, and his eyes, in the stark morning light, were chips of ice. "You can go back," he said, the words blunt, like stones. "I'll give you the fare for the stagecoach. You can tell them whatever you want, that I was a brute, that the land was too hard. It doesn't matter." The offer, so cold and dismissive, was like a slap. "Go back?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Go back to what?" "That's not my concern," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I wrote for a wife, for a helper. I didn't write for someone to come out here and feel sorry for me. I don't need your pity." The accusation struck a nerve, igniting a spark of fury in her chest that burned away her fear. Pity? Was that what he saw in her eyes last night? Or was it what he saw in himself? "Pity?" she shot back, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised them both. "You think I crossed half a continent, left everything I knew behind, to come to this God-forsaken place out of pity for a man I'd never met? You think that lowly of yourself, Mr. Thorne, or is it that you think that lowly of me?" He was taken aback by her ferocity, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even respect, in his eyes before the shutters came down again. "I think you didn't know what you were signing on for." "And you did," she challenged, taking a step closer. The promise she had made to Elizabeth was a shield and a sword. It gave her the right to be here, the right to fight for this. "I came here to keep a promise. I am not a child who can be sent home because the weather is disagreeable. I am here to do a job, to be a wife. I will not be scared off by a hard land or a hard man." The words hung in the air between them. A declaration of war, or perhaps a treaty. He stared at her for a long, silent moment, his expression unreadable. She had not flinched. She had met his hardness with a steel of her own. Finally, he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "The cow needs milking," he said, turning his back on her and walking toward the barn. The argument, for now, concluded. Clara stood alone by the corral, her heart hammering, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had won the first battle, but she knew the war for this man's trust, for a life here, had only just begun. And so, their life together began. A strange apprenticeship in proximity and distance. Elias was a teacher of few words but infinite patience. He showed her how to milk the Jersey cow, his large, calloused hands briefly guiding hers on the teat before he pulled away as if burned, leaving her to finish the task with clumsy, determined fingers. He taught her how to sit a horse, a gentle mare named Daisy. His instructions clipped and practical. "Keep your heels down. Look where you're going, not at the ground. The horse knows the way better than you do." He never touched her, never offered a hand up or a steadying arm. He would demonstrate, then step back, leaving a chasm of empty space between them as he watched her with those critical, lonely eyes. Clara, in turn, threw herself into the work. It was a penance and a salvation. The physical exhaustion was a balm to her troubled mind. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, the pre-dawn chill of the milking shed, the scent of fresh coffee boiling on the stove, the relentless afternoon sun, the satisfying ache in her muscles at the end of the day. She brought a semblance of order to the cabin's interior, which had been clean but starkly impersonal. Soon, the scent of baking bread began to fill the small space, a warm, domestic aroma that seemed entirely alien to its surroundings. She found Elias's mending basket, overflowing with torn shirts and worn-out trousers, and set about repairing them, her needle moving with a quiet efficiency that was its own form of communication. The two Apache women, Atsa and Nali, remained an enigma. They moved at the periphery of Clara's new life, their presence as constant and as natural as the wind. They rarely spoke, and when they did, it was in their own tongue, a soft, flowing language that sounded like water over stones. Yet, a strange, unspoken friendship began to form. One morning, Clara found a small bundle of fragrant herbs on the cabin's doorstep, tied with a piece of sinew. She used them in a stew that night, and the flavor was rich and earthy. Elias ate it without comment, but she saw him take a second helping. A few days later, a freshly skinned rabbit appeared on a hook outside the kitchen door. Clara began to acknowledge their gifts with a nod and a smile. In return, she would leave a loaf of fresh bread or a jar of wild berry preserves on the bench outside. Atsa, the older of the two, with eyes that held the wisdom of the mountains, once watched Clara struggle to light the temperamental wood stove. Without a word, she entered the cabin, rearranged the kindling with a few deft movements, and had a cheerful fire roaring in seconds. She looked at Clara, a hint of a smile touching her lips, and then was gone. They were allies. Clara realized. 3 women navigating a world defined by a difficult man and a demanding land. The fragile truce between Clara and Elias held for weeks, a routine built on shared labor and immense, unspoken chasms. He would watch her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, a strange, hungry expression on his face, a look of a man starving for something he was terrified to ask for. But the moment she met his gaze, the mask of indifference would slam back into place. The change came on a sweltering afternoon in late summer. The air was thick and still, buzzing with the drone of insects. Clara took 2 wooden buckets and headed for the creek that snaked through the cottonwoods at the edge of the property, a ribbon of cool, green life in the parched landscape. She enjoyed the walk, the brief respite from the relentless heat of the cabin. She set her buckets down on the mossy bank and knelt, enjoying the cool spray on her face as she dipped the first one into the clear, running water. As she reached for the second bucket, she felt a sudden, lightning-hot strike on her calf. A strangled cry escaped her lips. She scrambled back, her heart seizing in her chest, and saw it, a timber rattlesnake, coiled and furious, its warning buzz a sound of pure menace before it slithered away into the dense undergrowth. Clara stared in horror at her leg. 2 small, neat puncture wounds were already beginning to swell, a malevolent purple blooming under her skin. A wave of searing pain shot up her leg, followed by a terrifying, dizzying nausea. Panic, cold and absolute, washed over her. The cabin was too far. She would never make it. She tried to stand, but her leg buckled, and the world began to tilt and fade to black at the edges. She never knew how he found her so fast. Perhaps he had been watching her from the barn, or perhaps some primal instinct had alerted him to her cry. But suddenly, he was there, crashing through the brush like a panicked stallion. "Clara!" His voice was raw, stripped of all its careful control. It was the first time he had used her given name, or what he believed to be her given name. He saw the snake bite in an instant, and a string of curses, sharp and violent, ripped from his throat. In one fluid motion, he was kneeling beside her, his face a mask of frantic, terrible concern. He ripped a strip of cloth from his own shirt and tied it tightly above the wound. Then, without a moment's hesitation, he scooped her into his arms. Clara's head fell against his chest. She could feel the frantic, heavy thud of his heart against her ear, could hear his ragged, desperate breaths as he began to run. carrying her as if she weighed nothing. The world was a dizzying, painful blur of green leaves and blue sky. "Stay with me, Elizabeth," he grunted, the name a painful reminder of her lie, even in her delirium. "Damn it, you stay with me!" His voice was no longer hard or cold. It was a plea, a prayer, a desperate command to a fate he had long since stopped trying to control. She faded in and out of consciousness on the agonizing journey back to the cabin. She was aware of the strength of his arms around her, the rough texture of his shirt against her cheek, the low, urgent murmurs he directed at her, words of reassurance that were more for him than for her. He burst into the cabin and laid her gently on his own bed, the larger, more accessible one in the main room. Atsa and Nali appeared as if from nowhere, their faces grim. What followed was a blur of pain and fevered dreams for Clara. She was vaguely aware of Elias holding her leg, his face pale and set, as he used his knife to open the wounds. She felt the searing, awful sensation of his mouth on her skin as he tried to draw the venom out, his desperation a tangible force in the room. Atsa and Nali moved with silent efficiency, applying a poultice of crushed herbs that smelled of earth and something sharp, forcing a bitter tea between her lips. Through it all, Elias never left her side. Clara finally surfaced from the feverish fog late that night. The pain in her leg had subsided to a dull, throbbing ache. The cabin was dark, save for a single lantern turned down low on the table, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She felt a cool cloth on her forehead and turned her head. Elias was sitting in a chair pulled right up against the bed, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. He looked utterly spent, his shoulders slumped in exhaustion and relief. He had not slept. As she watched, he lifted his head and looked at her, and in that moment, she saw him, for the first time, without any walls, without any pretense. The raw terror, the profound regret, and a deep, aching tenderness were all laid bare in his eyes. He looked at her not as a mail-order bride, not as a helper, but as something precious he had come terrifyingly close to losing. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He quickly wiped it away, but she had seen it. "You're awake," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She could only nod, her throat too dry to speak. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His touch was feather-light, tentative, a question and an apology all in one. The chasm between them had vanished. In its place was a fragile, shimmering thread of connection, forged in fear and sealed in the silent, lantern-lit intimacy of the room. In the days that followed, everything was different. He carried her to the chair by the hearth in the morning and back to bed at night. He cooked for her, clumsy but determined, his stews and broths infused with the herbs Atsa provided. They began to talk, not about the past or the future, but about small things, the way the light hit the hills in the evening, the stubbornness of the Jersey cow, the progress on the corral fence. When she was strong enough to walk, he walked beside her, his arm hovering near her back, ready to catch her if she stumbled. They worked together, repairing the section of corral fence he had been mending that first morning. They moved in a comfortable, easy silence, passing the hammer back and forth, their hands brushing occasionally. Each accidental touch was a small jolt of electricity, a reminder of the new, unspoken intimacy that now defined their world. The quiet moments, once filled with tension, were now laden with a powerful, accumulating weight of emotion, a shared understanding that needed no words at all. The snakebite had been a kind of baptism, a venomous initiation that had burned away the last of their pretenses. In the quiet days of Clara's recovery, the space between them had transformed. The silence was no longer a barren desert of awkwardness, but a rich, fertile soil where a fragile trust had begun to take root. They spoke more, their conversations meandering from the practicalities of the day to the small, forgotten memories of their pasts. Each shared story, a single stone laid in the foundation of a bridge between their two solitudes. One evening, as the sun bled a spectacular palette of orange and violet across the western sky, they sat on the porch of the cabin, the day's work done. The air was soft and cool, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. Clara was mending one of Elias's shirts, her needle moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Elias was cleaning a rifle, his movements economical and precise. "You never speak of your family," Clara said softly, her voice barely disturbing the immense quiet. It was not an interrogation, but a gentle invitation. Elias's hands stilled. He set the rifle down carefully across his lap and stared out at the horizon, his eyes fixed on a place only he could see. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Clara feared she had overstepped, that the wall she had worked so hard to breach would be rebuilt before her very eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough thing, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. "There's not much to tell. They're gone." "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head, a small, bitter motion. "Sorry's a word for accidents. What happened to them was no accident." He picked up a small wet stone and began to sharpen a knife. The rhythmic asterisk of steel on stone, a grim accompaniment to his words. "My father, he wasn't like the other men around here. He believed the land was big enough for everyone. He saw the Apache not as savages, but as people. He learned their ways, how they hunted, how they read the seasons in the stars. He traded with them fairly. He called their chief his friend." The motion of the knife slowed. "My mother, she was the same. She learned their language, their medicines. Atsa's mother taught her which roots could break a fever, which leaves could soothe a wound. We were happy here. This place wasn't a fortress back then. It was a home." He set the knife and stone aside, his hands balling into fists on his knees. Then the trouble started. A few head of cattle went missing from a nearby ranch. It was a hard winter, and it was probably just rustlers, but it was easier to blame the Apache. The folks in town, they needed someone to hate. They started calling my father an Indian lover, a traitor. They said he was giving them information, helping them raid his own kind. His voice was raw now, stripped of all its usual control. It was a lie, a vicious, ugly lie. But lies are easier to believe than the truth when you're scared. One night, a mob rode out from town. They were drunk on whiskey and self-righteousness. They weren't looking for justice. They were looking for blood. He fell silent, his throat working. Clara's heart ached for him, for the boy he must have been. She put her mending aside, her full attention on him, offering her silence as a sanctuary for his pain. "I was 10. He finally continued, his voice barely a whisper. "My mother hid me in the root cellar. She told me not to make a sound, no matter what I heard. And I heard everything. The shouting, the breaking glass, my father's voice, trying to reason with them. Then, the gunshots." He shuddered, a tremor that racked his entire body. "I stayed in that cellar until the sun came up. I was so scared. When I finally came out, They were by the barn. The mob had made an example of them." He couldn't continue. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the force of a grief he had held inside for 15 years. Clara moved without thinking, her hand coming to rest on his back, a small, steady point of contact in his storm of memory. "They said my parents got what they deserved for betraying their own," he said, his voice muffled by his hands. "I grew up with that, with the whispers, the stares, the son of the traitors. I learned to hate them, the whole damn town, but I think I hated myself more. I was just a boy, but I kept thinking, if I'd been older, if I'd been stronger, maybe I could have done something." He finally looked up at her, his eyes swimming with a pain so profound it stole her breath. "So I stayed here. I built fences. I built walls. I made sure I would never need anyone, ever again. Because needing people, it gets you killed. The terrible, aching loneliness that clung to him like a shroud finally made sense. It wasn't just a preference, it was a shield, forged in the fires of an unimaginable trauma. Tears were streaming down Clara's face, tears for the boy in the root cellar, for the man who had been forced to carry such a burden alone. His confession, his ultimate act of trust, demanded one of her own. The lie she had been carrying, the name she had been hiding behind, suddenly felt like a coward's burden. "Elias," she began, her voice trembling. "There's something I have to tell you. My name is not Elizabeth." He looked at her, his own grief momentarily forgotten, his expression one of pure confusion. "My name is Clara," she said, the words a torrent of confession now. "Elizabeth was my sister, my older sister. She was the one who answered your letters. She was the one who was supposed to come here to marry you." She took a ragged breath and forced herself to continue, to tell him the whole, unvarnished truth. She fell ill. A fever took her, just weeks before she was meant to leave, on her deathbed. She made me promise. She was so worried about you, your letters. She read them to me. She could hear the loneliness in them, and she didn't want you to be alone. She made me promise I would come in her place. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze, certain that this deception would be the final, insurmountable wall between them. "I came here to honor her, to keep my promise, but it's not about the promise anymore. I'm not here for her now. Elias, I stayed for you." She finally dared to look at him, her heart in her eyes. "I am not the woman in the letters, but I have fallen in love with the man who wrote them, with the man who sits beside me right now." He stared at her, his face a mask of stunned silence. He wasn't angry, he wasn't betrayed. He just looked thunderstruck. He processed her words, the depth of her sister's compassion, the magnitude of her own sacrifice, the stunning, terrifying beauty of her confession. He had just laid bare the ugliest part of his soul, and her response had not been to recoil, but to offer him her own truth, and with it, her heart. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek, wiping away a tear with his thumb. "Clara," he said, tasting the name on his lips for the first time. It sounded right. It sounded true. "Your name is Clara." It was all he said, but it was enough. It was acceptance. It was forgiveness. It was a new beginning. As if on cue, the world outside seemed to respond to the seismic shift that had just occurred between them. The sky, which had been a placid purple, was darkening to a bruised, angry gray in the west. A low, ominous rumble echoed from the distant mountains. A sudden, cold wind whipped across the porch, smelling of ozone and rain, scattering dust and leaves before it. "Storm's coming," Elias said, his voice low. "A bad one. We need to get the animals into the barn." They worked with a frantic, silent efficiency, their earlier confessions hanging in the air between them, a charge of unspoken electricity that crackled with the approaching lightning. They herded the nervous cattle and horses into the safety of the large, sturdy barn, just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, hitting the dry earth with audible splats. They barred the heavy wooden doors just as the sky opened up, the rain coming down in a solid, deafening sheet. Inside, the world was reduced to the confines of the barn. The air was thick with the warm, earthy smells of hay, animals, and damp earth. Elias lit a single kerosene lantern, its golden glow pushing back the oppressive darkness, casting long, dancing shadows that made the cavernous space feel both intimate and immense. The storm raged outside, a wild, elemental fury. The wind howled like a banshee, and the rain hammered against the roof like a frantic drum roll. A deafening crack of thunder exploded directly overhead, so loud the very timbers of the barn seemed to shake. Clara cried out and flinched, an involuntary reaction to the violent sound. In an instant, Elias was at her side. "It's all right," he said, his voice a low rumble, a comforting counterpoint to the storm's chaos. He didn't think, He just acted. His arm went around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. It was not the desperate, frantic embrace of the snakebite. This was a conscious, deliberate act of comfort, of possession, of shelter. Clara leaned into him, her fear of the storm momentarily forgotten, replaced by the overwhelming reality of his closeness. She could feel the solid strength of his body, the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder. She turned her head, her face buried in his chest, and inhaled his scent: leather, rain, and the clean, honest smell of the man himself. He held her tightly as another peal of thunder shook the barn. When it passed, a profound silence fell between them, deeper and more charged than the roar of the storm. He loosened his hold slightly, and she tilted her head back to look at him. In the flickering, golden light of the lantern, his face was a landscape of shadow and emotion. The hardness was gone. The loneliness was gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded hunger that mirrored her own. All the unspoken words, all the pent-up emotions, all the longing they had both denied for so long, finally crested, a wave too powerful to hold back. He lowered his head, and she rose on her toes to meet him. Their first kiss was not gentle. It was a collision, a desperate, searching thing. It was fierce and painful, a raw expression of 2 lifetimes of solitude and sorrow finally finding an anchor in the storm. It was the taste of rain and tears, of regret and hope, of a loneliness so profound it could only be answered by the solace of another's touch. A different kind of storm, one of suppressed passion and desperate need, broke inside the barn. The kiss deepened, becoming a language all its own, a conversation of touch and breath that said everything their words could not. His hands moved from her back to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks as if to memorize the feel of her. Her fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, unwilling to let him go. They broke apart, breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. In the lantern light, their eyes burned with a mixture of desire and fear, a terror at the vulnerability they were surrendering to, and an overwhelming need to surrender to it completely. There were no more words. There was no need for them. With a touch that trembled with the weight of all they had held back, they crossed the final boundary, finding in each other's arms a sanctuary from the storm outside, and a final, shattering release from the terrible solitude within. The storm passed as completely as a forgiven sin, leaving the world scrubbed clean and glistening in its wake. Elias awoke before dawn. The unfamiliar warmth of Clara's body curled against his back, a startling, profound comfort. He slipped from the bed in the main room, where they had fallen asleep after the storm's fury and their own had subsided, and gently covered her with the quilt. He left her to her rest, needing a moment to face the sunrise, and himself alone. He sat on the top rail of the corral fence, a solitary figure in the vast, silent landscape. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of wet sage and clean earth. The rising sun struck the peaks of the distant mountains, and the light spilled across the plains, igniting the million tiny droplets of water that clung to every blade of grass, every strand of wire, turning the world into a field of diamonds. This was the same sunrise he had witnessed every day for 15 years, but today it was different. Today, for the first time since he was a boy, it did not feel like the start of another day of lonely survival. It felt like a beginning, and that terrified him. The fierce, protective joy that had bloomed in his chest was an emotion so foreign and so potent, it felt like a vulnerability. To have something, to have someone meant you had something to lose. The ghosts of his parents felt painfully close in the quiet morning air, a solemn reminder of what happened to people who dared to build a life on love in this unforgiving land. He was still sitting there, lost in thought, when the riders appeared on the horizon. It was a group of 5 men from town, their presence a dark, jarring intrusion on the morning's peace. Elias's body went rigid. He recognized the man in the lead instantly, Silas Blackwood, a rancher whose property bordered his own, a man whose heart was as sour and barren as his overgrazed land. Blackwood had been a young man when Elias's parents were killed, a vocal supporter of the mob. His hatred for Elias and his family was an old, festering wound. Elias slid off the fence and stood his ground as they rode up, his face settling into the cold, hard mask he reserved for the world beyond his property line. "Thorn," Blackwood sneered, his voice dripping with sanctimonious authority. He didn't dismount, preferring to literally look down on Elias. His companions, a posse of town loafers and sycophants, fanned out behind him. "Blackwood," Elias replied, his voice flat and devoid of welcome. "You're trespassing." "We've come on righteous business," Blackwood declared, his eyes flicking past Elias to the cabin. "The whole town's talking. First, you keep a pair of Apache squaws out here, and now you've got yourself a mail-order woman living under the same roof. It's an affront to God and decent folk." The cabin door opened, and Clara stepped out onto the porch, drawn by the sound of voices. She had dressed and pulled her hair back, but she still had the soft, well-loved look of a woman who had just left a warm bed. Seeing her, Blackwood's sneer widened into a triumphant, ugly grin. Well, there she is, the whore of Babylon herself, shacked up with the trader's son and his savage pets. You've turned this homestead into a den of iniquity. Thorn." Elias took a threatening step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You watch your mouth, Blackwood." "Or what?" one of the other men jeered. "You'll have your women attack us." "We're here to give you a warning," Blackwood continued, ignoring the interruption. "You get rid of these heathens and marry this woman proper, or we're bringing Reverend Miller out here. He'll have you charged with lewd and lascivious cohabitation. We'll see you run out of this territory for good." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dirt near Elias's feet. "You've got 1 week." Without another word, he wheeled his horse around, and the group rode off, their mocking laughter hanging in the clean morning air like a foul poison. Clara stood frozen on the porch, her face pale. Elias turned to look at her, and the hope that had flickered in his heart just an hour before was extinguished, replaced by the cold, familiar ache of despair. He saw not the woman he loved, but another target, another person whose life would be ruined simply by being associated with him. He strode into the cabin, his movements stiff with a terrible resolve. "Pack your trunk," he said, his voice as hard and lifeless as it had been the day she arrived. Clara followed him, her heart sinking. "What? No, Elias, I'm not—" "Did you hear him?" he snapped, turning on her, his eyes wild with a desperate, protective fury. "Did you hear what they said? This is my fight, not yours. This is the poison I've lived with my whole life. I will not have it taint you. I will not see you destroyed because of me. I'm taking you to the stagecoach. Today." "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She stood before him, refusing to back down. "I told you before, I am not leaving. My answer hasn't changed. Your trouble is my trouble now. I will not run." "You don't understand," he roared, his control finally breaking. "They will do to you what they did to my parents. They will whisper and lie and spit on your name until you are nothing. They will break you. I won't let that happen." "So you would break my heart instead?" she cried, tears welling in her eyes. "You would send me away to save me? That is not protection. Elias, that is cowardice." "The man I spent the night with in the barn was not a coward." Her words hit him harder than a physical blow. He staggered back, the anger draining out of him, leaving him looking lost and defeated. It was then that a new voice, quiet but firm, cut through the tension. "She is right. You are not a coward. Elias Thorn." They both turned. Atsa and Nali stood in the doorway, their expressions solemn. It was Atsa who had spoken, her English careful and precise. "They do not know you," she continued, stepping into the room. Nali followed, her dark eyes fixed on Elias with an expression of fierce loyalty. "We know you." Atsa turned her gaze to Clara. "You must know our story, why we are here." She took a breath, and for the first time, she and Nali shared the full truth. "A man from the government, an agent. He came to our people. He promised food and blankets for the winter if we sent 2 women to be wives for the new homesteaders. He said it was a way to make peace. Our father, the chief, he did not want to, but our people were hungry. So we were sent." Nali took up the story, her voice softer than Atsa's, but just as clear. "We were brought to Promise Creek. They meant for us to go to men like that one," she said, gesturing with her chin in the direction Blackwood had ridden. "Men who look at us and see animals, but there was a mistake with the papers. We were brought here instead, to the home of the man the town hated." "He found us on his porch," Atsa said. "He did not know we were coming. He could have sent us away. He could have used us, as the other men would have. But he did not. He looked at us, and he saw 2 women who were cold and scared and far from home. He gave us shelter. He shared his food. He asked for nothing. He has never, not once, laid a hand on us or spoken a dishonorable word. He is the only man in that town who has treated us like human beings." The weight of their testimony filled the room. This was the truth of Elias Thorne, a truth the town would never see. Clara looked at him, her heart overflowing with a love so fierce it felt like it might break her ribs. "There," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound conviction. "That is the man I will not leave. That is the man I will fight for." She turned and marched out of the cabin before Elias could say another word. It was Sunday. The town of Promise Creek was gathered for worship. The fine ladies in their bonnets, the men in their stiff collars. They stood in clusters on the dusty ground in front of the small, white-painted church, exchanging pleasantries and gossip before the service began. Reverend Miller, a man whose piety was far exceeded by his fear of his congregation's powerful members, stood on the steps, smiling benignly. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Clara Thompson marched through them. She was not dressed for church. She wore her simple, calico work dress. Her sleeves were rolled up, and her face was set with a formidable, righteous anger. She walked to the bottom of the church steps, turned, and faced them all. A shocked silence fell over the crowd. Silas Blackwood, standing near the Reverend, scowled. "I have something to say," Clara announced, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent square. "You people, you call yourselves Christians. You come here every Sunday and you pray to a God of love and forgiveness. And then you spend the rest of the week poisoning your own well with hatred and lies." A scandalized murmur rippled through the crowd. "You have passed judgment on a man you do not know," she continued, her voice rising with passion. Her eyes scanned the crowd, meeting the gazes of the women who had whispered about her, the men who had jeered. "You speak of Elias Thorne as if he is a blight on this land. You condemn him for his kindness to 2 women who were abandoned and alone. You call his compassion a sin. The real sin, the real blight, is the hatred you harbor in your own hearts." She pointed a finger directly at Silas Blackwood. "You, and men like you. You hide your cruelty behind a mask of righteousness. You murdered his parents for the crime of seeing humanity in their neighbors. And you have persecuted him ever since. But you have not broken him." Her gaze softened as she scanned the crowd again, her voice now filled with a raw, pleading honesty. "I came to this place a stranger, with nowhere else to go. Elias Thorne took me in. He has been patient and honorable and kind. He has protected me and cared for me and asked for nothing in return. He is the best man I have ever known." She took a breath, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a confession for the whole town to hear. "And he has never once told me that he loves me." Just as those words left her lips, a figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. It was Elias. He had followed her, riding hard. He walked through the stunned, silent townspeople, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. The hard mask was gone. His face was open, vulnerable, filled with a love and an awe so powerful it was breathtaking. He reached the steps and, without a word, took her hand in his. He turned her to face him, cupped her cheek with his free hand, and in the full glare of the early morning sun, before the eyes of God and the entire town of Promise Creek, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion like the one in the barn. It was a kiss of profound, soul-deep tenderness. It was a promise. It was a vow. It was a public declaration, a claiming, an act of defiance so simple and so pure it stunned everyone into absolute silence. He was the son of the traders, the town outcast, and she was his mail-order bride. And in that one perfect moment, they were more beautiful and more righteous than anyone else in that town had ever been. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, and whispered the only two words that mattered. "I do now." The kiss on the church steps was not an end to their troubles, but a declaration of war. It silenced the crowd, but it did not change their hearts. In the days that followed, the air in Promise Creek grew thick with a righteous, simmering fury. Clara and Elias had thrown down a gauntlet, and Silas Blackwood was more than happy to pick it up. He saw their public display not as an act of love, but as a flagrant challenge to the town's established order, and to his own authority within it. The official response came a week later, delivered by the town's sheriff, a man named Cobb, whose spine was as flexible as his political allegiances. He rode out to the ranch, his badge glinting in the harsh afternoon sun, a folded piece of paper in his hand. He found Elias and Clara reinforcing the corral, working together in the easy, synchronized rhythm they had developed. "Thorne," Cobb said, avoiding Clara's eyes. "I've got an official complaint here, sworn out by Mr. Blackwood and a dozen other concerned citizens." He unfolded the paper. "You're hereby charged with unlawful and lascivious cohabitation, living in sin with 3 women, 2 of 'em savages. You've got a court date in front of the circuit judge in 30 days. If you're found guilty, you'll forfeit this land and be expelled from the territory." He handed the paper to Elias, who took it without a word, his face a mask of stone. The sheriff, having done his duty, seemed eager to leave. He tipped his hat awkwardly in Clara's direction and rode off, a man fleeing the consequences of his own errand. Elias stared at the paper, the legalistic words a far more dangerous weapon than a mob's torches. This was a cold, calculated effort to erase him, to use the law to finish the job the whispers and hatred had started. "They won't win," Clara said, her voice a low, fierce promise. She took the paper from his hand, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it into the dust. "They can't, because they are wrong, and we are not." That evening, a council of war was held at the small cabin table. The 4 of them, Elias, Clara, Atsa, and Nali, sat in the flickering lamplight, a small island of defiance in a hostile world. It was Clara who formulated the plan. "They say a dozen men signed this complaint," she said, her eyes bright with a strategist's fire. "Then we will find more people to sign a statement in your defense. There have to be some decent folk in that town, people who believe in fairness more than they believe Silas Blackwood's lies." Elias was skeptical. "The decent folk learned to keep their heads down a long time ago." "Then it's time they learned to lift them up again," Clara countered. And so, the next day, an unlikely trio set out to save a man's home. Clara, Atsa, and Nali rode into Promise Creek. Clara, armed with a pen and a sheaf of paper headed with a simple, eloquent statement about Elias Thorne's good character. Atsa and Nali, her silent, formidable honor guard. Their presence was a statement in itself, a direct contradiction to the town's narrative of savage pets. They were women of dignity and strength, and their quiet loyalty to Elias spoke volumes. They started with the blacksmith, a burly German immigrant named Schmidt who valued hard work over gossip. He read the paper, grunted, and signed his name with a flourish. "Thorne pays his bills," he said, by way of explanation. That is more than I can say for Blackwood." They went to the general store owner, who, after much nervous glancing out the window, finally signed, whispering that Elias was one of his few customers who didn't try to cheat him on the price of flour. They received a signature from a widow on the edge of town, whose fence Elias had repaired after a storm 2 years ago, and from a young cowboy who had once been given water from Elias's well when his own horse went lame. Each signature was a small victory, a tiny chip in the town's wall of animosity, but for everyone they gained, they were met with a dozen slammed doors, with curses, with pious lectures on decency and God's law. By the end of the day, they had only 7 names. It was a start, but it was not enough. The true retaliation came not with papers and laws, but with fire. It happened on a moonless night. A week later, a suffocating darkness pressed in on the small ranch. Clara was jolted from a deep sleep by a frantic whinnying from the barn, a sound of pure animal terror. She sat bolt upright, her heart instantly pounding. Then she smelled it. Smoke. "Elias!" she screamed. He was already moving, pulling on his trousers, his senses instantly alert. He threw open the cabin door, and they were met with a scene from hell. The barn, the beautiful, sturdy barn that had been their sanctuary during the storm, was engulfed in flames. Orange and yellow tongues of fire licked at the night sky, devouring the dry timber with a hungry, monstrous roar. "The horses!" was all Elias yelled. He ran toward the inferno, grabbing a bucket and an axe as he went. There was no thought for his own safety, no hesitation. The animals were trapped, and he was their only hope. Clara, Atsa, and Nali followed, their minds reeling with shock and terror, forming a desperate bucket brigade from the well. Elias smashed the small side door open with the axe, disappearing into the churning smoke and swirling embers. Clara screamed his name, her voice lost in the roar of the fire. Inside, it was a vortex of heat and chaos. The terrified screams of the horses were deafening. Blinding smoke filled his lungs, and the intense heat seared his skin. He found Daisy, her eyes white with panic, and managed to slap her toward the opening. He untied the other 2, his hands clumsy in the choking darkness, shoving and pulling them through the smoke toward the hope of clean air. Just as the last horse bolted into the night, a heavy flaming crossbeam crashed down from the loft, striking Elias a glancing blow on the shoulder and knocking him to the ground. For a moment, the world went black. He came to, his head spinning, the taste of ash and blood in his mouth. The fire was everywhere now, the main roof groaning, ready to collapse. He crawled, dragging his burning leg, his lungs on fire. His only thought the image of Clara's face. He had to get back to her. He burst out of the doorway just as the roof caved in with a sound like the world ending, sending a volcano of sparks and embers into the sky. He collapsed onto the muddy, scorched earth. Clara was there in an instant, screaming his name, her tears carving clean paths through the soot that already covered her face. Atsa and Nali were close behind, their faces masks of horror. He was alive, but barely. His shirt was burned away in places, his skin blistered and raw. A nasty gash on his head was bleeding freely, and his leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. Clara knelt in the mud beside him, oblivious to the heat and the smoke, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch, afraid she might break him. "Elias," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "Oh, God, Elias!" He reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. He was covered in blood and mud and soot, but his eyes, when they met hers, were clear. "The horses?" he rasped. "They're safe," she choked out. "You saved them." He squeezed her hand, a flicker of a smile touching his cracked lips. And then he passed out. Clara cried out in despair, clutching his filthy, blood-streaked hand to her cheek as if she could will her own life force into him. "Don't you leave me," she wept, her words a desperate vow whispered into the chaos. "You hear me, Elias Thorne? You are not allowed to leave me. I will not let you. I will never, ever let you go." The fire took everything: the barn, their winter hay, most of their tools, but it did not take them. With Atsa and Nali's skilled knowledge of herbs and healing, and Clara's relentless, round-the-clock care, Elias slowly began to mend. His burns were treated with soothing poultices, his fever broken with bitter teas, his legs set and splinted. But survival became a brutal, daily struggle. They were entering the driest part of the season with no shelter for their animals and dwindling supplies. The well water level dropped, and every bucketful was precious. They rationed everything, sharing a single loaf of bread between the four of them, a thin stew their only supper. It was a life stripped down to its barest essentials, a constant battle against a land that seemed determined to break them. Yet, in that hardship, something miraculous happened. Their love, forged in passion and defiance, was now tempered in the fires of shared suffering. It became a quiet, unbreakable thing. It was in the way Clara would gently clean his wounds, her touch infinitely tender. It was in the way Elias, even in his pain, would watch her, his eyes filled with a love that was almost worshipful. It was in the way Atsa and Nali would hunt, bringing back a rabbit or a prairie chicken, ensuring there was always something for the pot. They were no longer four separate people. They were a single, functioning unit, a family bound not by blood, but by a fierce, protective loyalty. One afternoon, as Elias was finally able to limp around the property, he stared at the blackened, skeletal remains of the barn. "The well," he said, his voice raspy. "The water's getting too low. There's an old well my father dug, closer to the creek. He capped it when he dug the new one. Maybe there's still water in it." It was a desperate hope, but it was all they had. The next day, he and Clara went to the spot, a small, overgrown hollow near the cottonwoods. They worked together, Clara clearing the brush, Elias leaning on a crude crutch, using a shovel to pry away the heavy stones that covered the old well shaft. It was slow, back-breaking work, but they did it together, their movements a silent, supportive dance. After hours of digging, they finally cleared the cap. Below was a dark, stone-lined shaft, but near the top, nestled in a dry, protected alcove in the stonework, was a small, tin box, rusted but intact. With trembling hands, Elias lifted it out. He pried open the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small stack of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was his mother's, the addressee his father's. They were love letters. They sat there, on the edge of the well that promised a future, and read the words that illuminated the past. They were not grand, poetic declarations, but simple, beautiful testaments to a deep and abiding love. His mother wrote of the small joys of her day, a new calf being born, the success of her garden. His father wrote back, his letters penned on the trail during cattle drives, speaking of his longing for home, for her. They were the words of two people who had built a life, a home, and a profound love in the very heart of the wilderness that had eventually taken them. Elias read a passage aloud, his voice thick with unshed tears. "My dearest John," his mother had written, "do not worry for us. The wind may howl, and the work may be hard, but my heart is full. I have you, I have our boy, and I have this land. It is all the heaven I shall ever need." A single tear, then another, traced a path through the dust on Elias's cheek. He was not weeping for the boy in the root cellar, or for the lonely man he had become. He was weeping for the beautiful, simple truth he now held in his hands. His parents hadn't been traitors or victims. They had been lovers. They had been happy. They had won. Clara wrapped her arms around him, and he leaned his head on her shoulder, and finally, truly, let go of the grief he had carried for so long. In the quiet of that afternoon, surrounded by the ghosts of a love that had come before, their own love was transformed. It was no longer a desperate act of salvation, a refuge from loneliness. It was a resurrection. From the literal and figurative ashes of the past, they were not just surviving. They were building something new, something strong, something that, like the old well itself, promised to bring forth life, even from the hardest ground. The circuit judge was not due for another 2 weeks, and in that time, news in the territory traveled in its own mysterious ways, carried by dust-choked stagecoach drivers, gossiping cavalry patrols, and the silent, efficient moccasin telegraph of the native peoples. The story of Atsa and Nali, the 2 Apache women living under the protection of the town outcast, had become a piece of regional folklore, and that folklore, against all odds, reached the ears of those who had been searching for them. They arrived not as a threat, but as an embassy, a small, proud delegation of Chiricahua Apache, led by a young warrior whose bearing was that of a prince, and an elder whose face was a beautiful, intricate map of 100 hard seasons. They rode not with the furtive stealth of raiders, but with the open, dignified purpose of men on a mission of honor. They stopped at the edge of Elias's property, a silent, respectful request for parley. Atsa and Nali saw them first. A cry, a mixture of disbelief and joyous recognition, broke from Atsa's lips. They ran, their feet flying over the dry ground, and the stoic, proud warrior broke into a grin, dismounting to embrace them. He was their brother, come to bring them home. The story that unfolded was one of bureaucratic error and profound relief. The government agent who had brokered the disastrous Wives for Provisions deal had been found to be corrupt, his records a tangled mess of lies. Atsa and Nali had been reported as lost, presumed to have run off. Their tribe had been searching for them for months. Their brother, Cochise's own nephew, had finally picked up the cold trail that led, improbably, to the most hated homestead in the territory. Their departure was arranged for the following morning. That evening, a feast was held. It was a strange and beautiful gathering. The Apache warriors sat around the fire with Elias and Clara, sharing the roasted prairie chicken and the last of Clara's bread. Language was a barrier, but it did not matter. A deeper understanding flowed between them, an unspoken respect between people who knew the harsh realities of the land. Before they left, as the morning sun cast long, cool shadows across the plains, Atsa and Nali came to say their farewells. They presented Clara with a blanket, woven with intricate geometric patterns in deep reds and earthy browns, a piece of art that was breathtaking in its beauty and craftsmanship. To Elias, they gave a strong, spirited mustang from their own herd, a gesture of ultimate respect. Atsa, who had been the voice for both of them, placed her hand on Clara's shoulder, her dark, intelligent eyes full of a wisdom that transcended words. "When we came here, we were prisoners," she said, her English deliberate. "You made us family." Then she turned to Elias, and Nali stepped forward to stand with her. Together, they placed their hands on his shoulders, a gesture of solemn blessing. "The people in the town, they hate you because your parents respected our people," Atsa said. "They do not understand. Respect is strength. Hatred is a sickness of the spirit." She looked around at the scorched earth where the barn had stood, at the small, defiant cabin, at the woman who stood steadfastly by his side. "You lost everything. You fought to survive. You protected your family. You shared the last of your water and the last of your food." A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "You have lived like the Apache." They embraced Clara one last time, nodded a final, respectful farewell to Elias, and mounted their horses. They rode away, not looking back, a part of the wild, beautiful landscape once more, leaving a silence in their wake that was as vast as the sky itself. In that silence, Clara felt a desperate need to capture what had happened, to give voice to the incredible, painful, beautiful story that had unfolded in this lonely place. That afternoon, she found an old, unused ledger in her trunk. On the first clean page, with a bottle of ink and a steady hand, she began to write. October 1876. My name is Clara Thompson Thorne. I say Thorne because in my heart, I am already his wife, though no preacher has said the words over us. I came to this place under a false name, to keep a promise to my dead sister. I did not expect to find a home. I did not expect to find love, and I certainly did not expect to find it in the heart of the bravest, kindest, most honorable man I have ever known. The act of writing was an act of claiming. She was no longer a disgraced woman from the East, a mail-order bride, or a victim. She was a chronicler, a historian of her own small, epic life. She wrote of the fire, of the snake bite, of the quiet courage of Atsa and Nali. She wrote of Elias's sorrow and his strength. She wrote their story, not for anyone else to read, but for themselves, a testament to the fact that they had existed, they had fought, and they had loved. As Clara filled the pages of her journal, Elias began to rebuild. His first task was the barn. The court date was still looming, a dark cloud on the horizon, but he refused to be paralyzed by it. To build was an act of faith, a defiant declaration that he intended to stay. He cleared the charred rubble with a grim determination, his mended leg and healing burns aching in protest. Clara worked beside him, hauling away blackened timbers, her hands growing as calloused as his. The blacksmith, Schmidt, having heard of the fire and the departure of the Apache delegation, rode out one day with his wagon loaded with tools and a supply of fresh-cut timber. "A man's barn is his castle," he grunted, unloading the supplies. "Blackwood is a snake. This town needs more men like you, Thorne, not less." He stayed for 3 days, his heavy hammer ringing a hopeful rhythm across the plains. His act of solidarity was a turning point. A few other men, the ones who had signed Clara's petition, began to quietly drop off supplies, a bag of nails, a few spare tools, a sack of oats for the horses. The tide of public opinion, if not turning, was at least beginning to ripple. After the barn was framed, a sturdy skeleton rising from the ashes, Elias turned his attention to the cabin. It had been his father's, a bachelor's shelter, a widower's shell. It had never truly been a home, with the same focused intensity. He began to transform it. He knocked out a new, larger window in the main room to let in the morning light. He planed the rough floorboards until they were smooth beneath Clara's bare feet. He built shelves for her books and jars, and a sturdy new table where they could eat their meals without feeling the ghosts of the past. Each nail he hammered was an affirmation of their future. He was not just rebuilding a structure. He was building a life for her, for them. The day the circuit judge was due to arrive, they stopped their work. They did not ride into town to hear the verdict. They had made their case, not in a courtroom, but in their survival, in their defiance, in the quiet dignity with which they had faced down hatred. They decided to get married. There would be no church, no white dress, no congregation of hypocrites. They walked hand in hand to the creek, to the spot where he had found her after the snake bite, the place where their old life had ended and their new one had begun. The cottonwood leaves rustled in the gentle breeze, a sound like a soft chorus. The water chuckled over the smooth stones. The sky above was a vast, cloudless, brilliant blue. Clara wore her simple work dress, the one she had mended a dozen times. Elias wore a clean shirt, his hair still damp from the creek. He had no ring, but he had spent the morning braiding a thin, strong circlet from the tail hair of the Mustang Atsa and Nali had given him, a symbol of the wild, unbreakable spirit they now shared. They faced each other, the world their only witness. "Clara," Elias began, his voice low and steady, but thick with an emotion that made her heart ache. "I have nothing to offer you but this land, and my name, and my whole heart. I was a man living in a tomb, and you walked in and you threw open the windows. You are my home. I love you, before the sky and the water and the land. I ask you to be my wife." Tears streamed freely down Clara's face as she took his hand. "Elias," she whispered, her voice catching. "I came here with nothing but a promise and a past full of shame. You gave me a reason to be proud. You gave me a place to belong. My heart is already yours. It has been from the beginning. Yes, I will be your wife." He slid the braided ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit, and there, with the sun on their faces and the song of the creek in their ears, they sealed their vows with a kiss that was deep and slow and full of a profound, unshakable peace. They were married, truly, finally, irrevocably married. That night, they returned to the transformed cabin, a new home, for a new life. It was not the first time they had shared a bed, not the first time they had known the fierce intimacy of each other's bodies. But that night was different. The first time, in the barn, had been a desperate, frantic act of discovery, a collision of two lonely souls in a storm. This was a quiet, sacred homecoming. There were no more secrets, no more lies, no more fear of the past or the future. When he came to her, it was with a reverence and a tenderness that spoke of a love that had been tested by fire and found to be true. And when she opened her arms to him, it was with the complete, trusting surrender of a woman who had finally, against all odds, found the one place in the world where she was completely and utterly safe. They were not just lovers seeking refuge from a storm. They were husband and wife, two halves of a single, resilient soul, finally at peace, finally home, belonging to each other in a way that was more profound and more complete than any preacher's words or legal document could ever declare. A year is a lifetime in the West. It is long enough for a field to lie fallow and be reborn, for a sapling to take root, for a wound to scar over and become a part of the landscape of a man. The seasons turned, and the Thorne homestead turned with them. The raw, black scar where the barn had stood was now the site of a new structure, its fresh pine timbers smelling of resilience and futurity. The cabin, once a simple box against the vast emptiness, had grown. A new room added, its windows larger, as if the house itself had learned to open its eyes and breathe. The news from town had come anticlimactically. Sheriff Cobb had ridden out a month after the fire, looking sheepish and uncomfortable. The circuit judge, a man of surprising practicality, had taken one look at the complaint, heard the story of the departed Apache women from a few nervous but honest townsfolk, noted the list of signatures Clara had gathered, and dismissed the case with a wave of his hand as a waste of the court's valuable time. Silas Blackwood's power had been broken not by a gunfight, but by the quiet, unshakable truth. Promise Creek, having been forced to look in the mirror by Clara's stand, did not suddenly become a haven of tolerance, but a grudging respect had taken root. The Thorne place was no longer a pariah's den. It was a landmark, and it had become a sanctuary. Elias, in honoring the memory of his father, had surpassed him. He had not just made peace with his neighbors, he had created a new kind of neighborhood. The sign he hammered into the post at the start of his lane was simple, its letters carved by his own hand. Asterisk Thorne Ranch. All hands welcome. And they came. They came from all corners of the territory, drawn by the whispers of a place where a man was judged by the strength of his back and the honesty of his word, not by the color of his skin or the ghosts of his past. A drifter who had lost his family to cholera found work mending fences. A young Mexican couple, fleeing a cruel patron, were given a small plot to farm. And then came the children. They were the true outcasts of the West, the children of unions between soldiers and native women, between trappers and Spanish missionaries. They belonged nowhere. They arrived at the Thorne Ranch like frightened, half-wild colts, wary, silent, with eyes that held too much of the world's cruelty. One by one, Elias took them in. He gave them work suited to their size, a roof over their heads, and, for the first time in their lives, a place where their mixed blood was not a brand of shame, but simply a fact of their existence. If Elias gave them a place, it was Clara who gave them a home. The main room of the expanded cabin became a makeshift schoolhouse, with a piece of slate and a stub of chalk She taught them their letters, opening up a world beyond the hard horizon of their daily lives. But she taught them more than reading and writing. She taught them how to mend a shirt, how to bake bread, how to plant a seed and coax it into life. She taught them, through her own quiet example, that a life broken in one place could be rebuilt, stronger and more beautiful. In another, she was their teacher, their protector, their mother. She taught them how to live, and by showing them the unwavering, unconditional love she shared with Elias, she taught them how to love. And their own love had borne fruit. In the spring, as the prairie grass was turning a hopeful, vibrant green, Clara had given birth to their first child, a son. He was a beautiful, healthy baby with a tuft of dark hair like his father's and eyes that held the clear, steady blue of a summer sky. They named him John, for the grandfather he would never know, the man whose gentle words and faded letters had started it all. Little Johnny was the heart of the ranch, his gurgles and cries a constant, joyous music that filled the spaces once occupied by silence and sorrow. One morning, just as the first hint of gray was softening the edges of the night, Clara awoke. She lay still, listening to the familiar, comforting sound of Elias's deep, even breathing beside her. A soft coo came from the cradle in the corner, and she smiled. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the smooth wooden floor, and went to the cradle. She picked up her son, his small body warm and pliant in her arms, and held him close, his milky scent the sweetest perfume she had ever known. After she had nursed him and settled him back in his cradle, she returned to the bed. Elias lay on his side, his face turned toward her, his expression peaceful in the dim light. His face was no longer the hard, guarded mask of the man she had met at the stagecoach. The lines of bitterness and grief had been softened by laughter and peace. He looked younger, more whole. She knew, from the almost imperceptible twitch of his eyelids, that he was not truly asleep. He was waiting. She leaned down, her hair brushing against his cheek, and gently kissed him. It was a soft, lingering kiss, a silent conversation she had memorized by heart. It said, "Good morning. I am here. All is well." He stirred, a low, contented sound in his throat, and his eyes opened. They were clear and filled with a love that still, after all this time, had the power to take her breath away. He reached up and cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. A slow, easy smile spread across his face, the smile of a man who has awakened in paradise and is still not quite sure how he got there. He pulled her down for another kiss, this one deeper, a confirmation of the first. When they parted, he kept her close, his hand tangled in her hair, his gaze holding hers. "You're here," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, thick with the remnants of sleep and a profound, bone-deep wonder. "You're really here." The words were the same he had whispered to her on the church steps, but their meaning had deepened, ripened. It was no longer a cry of disbelief, but a quiet, grateful statement of fact. You are here. This life is here. This love, this child, this peace. It is all real. Later that morning, after the work was delegated and the children were at their lessons, Elias saddled their horses. "Come on," he said to Clara, a rare, boyish grin on his face. "Let's go for a ride." "Where are we going?" she asked, tying her bonnet under her chin. "Nowhere," he said, "and everywhere." They rode out together, leaving the sounds of the bustling, happy homestead behind them. They climbed the low rise where his parents were buried, the place now marked by two simple, clean wooden crosses and a profusion of wildflowers Clara had planted. They paused for a moment in silent communion, not with ghosts of sorrow, but with spirits of love, a debt of gratitude paid to the two people whose legacy they were now living. Then they urged their horses on, riding into the vast, open country that stretched before them. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, a brilliant, fiery orb that set the horizon ablaze. The land was no longer an adversary, a harsh, unforgiving wilderness to be survived. It was their partner, their home, its stark beauty, a reflection of the strength and resilience they had found in themselves and in each other. They rode side by side, their shoulders occasionally brushing, two small figures in an immense, majestic landscape, their long shadows stretching out behind them. They were not riding away from a painful past, but toward a future that was as bright and as boundless as the western sky. A future that no one, ever again, could deny them. Thank you for listening to this story from the heart of the American West. If this tale of love and resilience touched you, let us know in the comments where you're listening from around the world. We'd love to hear from you. Please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel for more stories like this. And don't forget to share your thoughts on Elias and Clara's journey.